Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short audio presentation, which will probably be a little longer than some of the others, I'm going to walk through the story of a specific exit event. So it's very rare that you can get a real full story about this type of transaction. Most of the information that happens behind the scenes of these kinds of transactions are treated as highly confidential for a variety of different reasons, some of which maybe you may see as we walk through this story. This story mostly protects confidentiality in individuals, but this event relates to a startup in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a relatively small business community and a small biotechnology community. The people who were involved in all of this are relatively well known. And so it's pretty important that you treat this as confidential. You shouldn't be sharing any of the specifics outside of class, and you definitely should not be sharing this presentation or recording with anyone else. So please try to be sensitive to that, because you're going to hear some of the real details behind an exit event. And if you begin talking about this with people in Madison, some of them will recognize the story very clearly and will know some of the people involved. So this is the story of Norides Corporation. Norides is actually a company that I co-founded with two other founders, Tom Moser, who's a former executive at Amoco, and then helped lead Amoco's foray into biotechnology of all things. And Phil Messersmith, a professor at the time at Northwestern University, who had developed this very interesting technology. He had noticed that barnacles can attach to wet, dirty rocks underwater, and that meant that there was some kind of adhesive that they were using that wasn't really very familiar to most commercial applications, because if you look, for example, at something like superglue, you'll notice that the instructions on the container say clean and dry the surface in order to get a good seal. And yet here were these barnacles creating very powerful adhesives underwater on wet, fouled surfaces. So powerful that, for example, it requires a hammer and chisel to get them off the bottoms of boats. So Dr. Messersmith evaluated the critical component of the protein that the barnacles and mussels were developing, and patented that through Northwestern University. And so we formed an organization, licensed the technology from Northwestern, and began working on a couple of different possible applications. One would be a liquid adhesive, or in order to actually link things together, a thin film adhesive for very specific types of applications, and then actually coatings that would be anti-adhesive coatings. You would attach a long molecule, polymer molecule, to the adhesive, and then that would prevent anything else from adhering to the surface. And because of the cost of production, it was clear we had to look at some very high-priced, high-value products, and we focused directly in areas of medical devices. There were a variety of possible applications in things like boat paint, but none of those were attractive in terms of the challenge of producing large quantities. So this venture was formed all the way back in 2004. By 2010, a significant amount of progress had been made. It was privately financed with over $11 million, including a Series A round led by Venture Investors, which is Madison's premier venture capital firm. A significant amount of intellectual property, a lot of money invested in the process of protecting that intellectual property, a couple $1 million worth of research grants as well, and some publicity. So it was the technology was featured on the cover of Nature magazine, which is one of the two premier scientific peer-reviewed academic journals in the world, and being on the cover is considered kind of a particularly nice honor. The technology was identified as one of the top 100 scientific developments in 2007 by Discover magazine. And so there was a lot going for the organization in terms of the technology and the longer term applications. But it was 6 years in, and at the time, we still did not actually have a product in direct commercial sales. We'd had a number of developments of technologies, some of which hadn't quite panned out the way we expected. We'd had some partnerships with medical device and pharmaceutical companies, but the research behind those ultimately was not successful. And so we kind of found ourselves in the situation where we needed to begin thinking about what was going to happen next. The company only had so much funding left, and in 2010, we had been introduced to a company called Kinsey-Nash Corporation. And Kinsey-Nash was a relatively small but publicly traded company that in the medical devices space, and it had some applications that where it looked like the adhesive technology that we had could be quite valuable. So we had a small R&D product development project with them, but even early on in the conversations, Norides Corporation executives had been talking with Kinsey-Nash about how well our technology fit with their overall corporate strategy of innovation and new ideas. Clearly, we had what we considered to be a platform technology that could be applied to many possible product combinations. And we'd been able to then move that conversation beyond just the original interests of the team that had contacted us. Over time, we developed more advocates at Kinsey-Nash, including people across their R&D groups, and then in particular their chief operating officer, who saw that there were some potential synergies between the technology that we had and some of the longer-term R&D that they wanted to do. So why did they like us? Well, there was a lot of overlap with the products and the clinical interests, the specific medical applications that we wanted to go after. They could see that we had a very solid intellectual property portfolio. We had some good animal evidence suggesting that the technology we had was neither toxic or otherwise problematic, and that it would perform as we expected in an in vivo situation. There were relatively defined regulatory paths, oversight from the FDA with regard to how this technology would be regulated. And we had a lot of independent validation. We had some contracts with other partners, some federal grants, and a whole bunch of peer-reviewed publications. We had a pretty convincing team of people with prior experience, some good consultants who lend credibility as well, both on the clinical and regulatory side, a solid board of directors, including 2 from industry and 1 representing our investor. And over time, folks at Norides began dropping some hints and then more clear statements that while we wanted to continue the R&D project that we were working on, we also might be open to the possibility of some kind of acquisition. So let's look a little bit behind the scenes of what was going on here to try to understand how this could develop. So first of all, as I mentioned, Kinsey-Nash, relatively small public company. Relatively recently, they'd had a fairly big dispute with one of their biggest customers, and were still sort of working their way out of that. Part of the problem there was that that big dispute, which was played out in public, had pushed their stock price down. And that was problematic because they had a hedge fund investor who was a relatively active investor and was demanding big changes in how the company was run. And so Kinsey-Nash was feeling a lot of pressure to show that they were using cash to build value. And a big piece of this was the fact that the range of acquisition price that Norides would be looking for was within their capabilities. And this is kind of a key piece that a lot of people miss out on, is that different acquisition targets have different price ranges. And so if, for example, we had thought that Norides was worth $1 billion, then there would have been no point in having a conversation in the first place, because Kinsey-Nash had no potential to make that kind of an acquisition. And Kinsey-Nash felt that they needed to show that they had a promising pipeline of products in order to avoid calls for cost cutting, which is what their activist hedge fund manager investor was really hoping to initiate. So they were under a certain amount of pressure behind the scenes in order to try to look. They wanted to look like they were really building the product pipeline, that they had innovation, but they were already doing as much R&D as could reasonably be expected based on their financials. They simply did not have the capacity to increase their R&D budget without looking like they were exceeding industry averages for R&D expenditures. So what's their BATNA? If you're not familiar with this phrase, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And this is mostly some speculation, of course, but one, they could have just delayed until they found a better acquisition target, but that was a little bit unlikely given the limitations in their price range that they were looking for. They really couldn't invest in more R&D. As I mentioned, they were already at the top end of what was considered acceptable for their industry. They could pay a dividend to investors, but that would have changed the way that their stock was perceived in the market. It would have changed them from being a growth stock to a value stock, and that quite likely would have led to more calls to cost cutting as well. So probably their BATNA, their best alternative, was just being patient. But the risks were real, even though they weren't that imminent or well-defined. But the bottom line is they could have walked away. I mean, they were not required to make this acquisition. Well, what about Norides? So we had a whole bunch of questions that needed to be answered. Do we sell the whole company or just spin off a piece of the intellectual property? Is an acquisition the right way to go, or just more funds from product development? There were some other factors that needed to be considered. The biotechnology market had not been significant for financing for quite a while. We had been trying to pitch for a extension to our Series A for quite a while unsuccessfully, and we were very concerned that we weren't going to be able to raise more money. And even if we did raise more money, it would be what's called a cram down, which would drop the valuation and reduce the value and ownership of a lot of the existing investors. We did have animal data, but some of it was a little mixed. Like, not all of the trials had gone completely as well as we might have liked. We did have some product stability issues that were still being addressed. And at the moment, we didn't have a lot of other partnership opportunities. And there were a whole bunch of other factors that were playing into this. It was hard to carve out intellectual property. If we wanted to simply spin out pieces of the specific patents or applications, that was going to be expensive. And if we were going to continue to go it alone to bring a product to market, we were going to have to make some fairly massive investments in quality systems, and it just didn't look like that was going to be an option. So what was our BATNA? Well, by September, we only had about 6 months of cash left. So we're actually really running close to the edge here. We did have some SBIR grants and other scientific grants that we expected to be funded, but because of some delays in Congress, it kind of looked like that money wouldn't actually be available to us until summer of 2011, which would be well after we'd already run out of cash. We had a tax credit coming, but we didn't know when that would be available. And again, we had relatively few options for other sponsorships. We'd already spent at this point, by September, almost $100,000 in preparation, legal documentation, intellectual property, and accounting fees. And our management team's already been focused on this now. The reality was our BATNA was not good. Like, walking away from this deal, if we couldn't make it work, could well have meant that the company would shut down somewhere in the next 6 months. So how did the negotiation go? Well, after everybody made it clear that we wanted to have this conversation, Keensey Nash made an offer in October, which had a very low upfront fee and then a whole bunch of contingent milestones. And contingent milestones are tricky in this kind of situation because as a small company, Norides was quite agile and it could change direction and reallocate resources, and Keensey Nash was not going to operate that way. Once this technology and the products were incorporated into Keensey Nash, they would be subject to all of the normal bureaucratic and corporate processes and policies. So milestones would be out of our control at that point in time, and there would be an incentive at Keensey Nash to potentially delay activity in order to not have to pay additional cash. So we had a very sophisticated negotiator who, instead of responding with just one suggestion or one option, came back with 3 options. And provided 3 different ways to go after the acquisition based on a couple of different factors, which they made very, very clear. One, that if we were going to have any contingencies, then there had to be mechanisms by which KNC would be forced to make progress. A second issue was KNC had to accept the regulatory risks, since they would have control over all the regulatory pathways from here on out. And they had to accept distribution risks. Again, if they were going to bring a product to market, it was their problem to make sure it could be sold and distributed. And there were 2 timing factors. One, they couldn't be slower than us. So if they're going to ask us to take on the risks of how long it would take products to come to market, then that was something that we couldn't be expected to have the financial consequences for, because they can't move as fast as we could. The problem with these milestone deadlines is they don't link up our interests anymore, because as I mentioned, now Kinsey Nash has a built-in incentive to delay in order to miss a milestone. We wouldn't suggest they would do it maliciously, but if things got close and they had to make a choice about how to invest capital, we'd be concerned that they would delay the Norides projects in order to not have to pay additional cash out for a milestone payment. And so this process kind of went back and forth with offers and counter offers. And meanwhile, of course, the clock is ticking on our side of things. So the effort was made to move to a cleaner deal. Things got really, really complicated, and eventually the Norides team pointed something out, which was that there was already $11 million invested into Norides, and if key shareholders didn't get at least their money back, then they'd probably veto the deal in its entirety. So there was a minimum amount of cash that had to be incorporated into the deal up front, or the odds are that it simply wouldn't go through at all. By just around Thanksgiving, a letter of intent was signed, and the deal terms were as shown: $17 million cash up front, and a $3 million holdback over 2 years. That means that there were some very specific things specifically associated with the intellectual property portfolio, and if those came to pass, then the remaining $3 million would be paid out. And the goal then was to close the deal by the end of the calendar year. And you'll notice that being already at the end of November, that doesn't leave a lot of time to actually get this deal closed. And one of the key reasons that Kinsey Nash wanted the deal closed as quickly as possible was because they had a shareholder call that they needed to do in January, and they wanted to announce the deal in January as a mechanism to help with their stock price. So they did have a big incentive to try to get this thing done as fast as possible. The process of closing out a deal is usually referred to as due diligence. That is a significant amount of research and documentation and information that has to be provided potentially by both sides prior to the deal being formally, officially closed. So some things went very smoothly. Intellectual property was the biggest value driver of the deal, and the company had a lot of work up front already done and good legal representation, and so almost everything on that went relatively smoothly. But some speed bumps did emerge. There were some corporate documentation issues. There were some records of board meetings and shareholder discussions. It's important to recognize that the company was required to document every corporate commitment and transaction it had ever made with anyone. That included, for example, renting a printer at one point for which we couldn't find the original agreement because that's technically a liability. And so every single one of those things had to be documented, tracked down, and so on. Another speed bump popped up, two specific past disputes. At one point, Norides had to lay off a couple of people, and that had resulted in one lawsuit, which then needed to be settled very, very quickly. And there had been at one point a partnership that had gone bad with another major company, and that documentation needed to be provided and explained as well. But all of these things continued to move forward relatively quickly. And then we ran into some delays. First, we had to renegotiate some third-party licenses, and in fact, one of those was with Northwestern University. They initially didn't like the terms of the deal, and they refused to sign over, to agree to sign over the licenses to Kinsey Nash, which was an absolutely essential component of the deal in the first place. In the end, there was a very close personal relationship between one of the people at Norides and the tech transfer office at Northwestern, and that person was able to sit down with the folks at Northwestern and point out the situation, and Northwestern eventually came around. But it's good to remember that sometimes it's all about the personal relationships. Like, we'd like to think that everybody makes business decisions based on just rational information, but a lot of times it comes down to whether you know the people well enough and can ask them to trust you. And then we had another delay. We had a technology evaluation problem where we sent a set of product samples to Kinsey Nash's facility out in New Jersey, and they contacted us to let us know that the technology had failed the test that we had agreed on. So there was a big rush towards getting more product samples created, getting them shipped out there, and helping them rerun the test to make sure that they were working the way they expected. We were able to extend the letter of intent till the end of January, but again, this deadline came up because they had this earnings call on February 1st that they absolutely wanted to be able to announce the investment, the acquisition. And then we had real problems. Our laboratory in the UW Research Park was flooded. Someone actually left a faucet running and flooded out the entire laboratory. Thousands of dollars of damage was caused. Luckily, everything was insured, but we immediately had to institute all of these incredible controls to ensure that nothing else would go wrong. And then the technology evaluation failed a second time. The third week in January, we sent an additional series of products to their facility in New Jersey, and the technology did not work the way that they were expecting it to, and we had a panic. We had to fly a couple of people out on a Sunday afternoon to New Jersey, where they spent 48 hours in the laboratory with the technicians at Kinsey Nash, tracking down what had happened and why the technology hadn't worked the way they expected, ultimately resolved the problem by identifying a difference in the way that Kinsey Nash scientists were preparing the experiments. That was eventually sorted out. The technology operated the way it was supposed to, and just in time, the deal was formally closed on January 28th of 2011. So what were the keys to actually having this work? Having the personal relationships, staying in constant communication with the acquirer, being responsive and honest. You have to recognize that the acquirer is going to do something different with the company and the technology than you will. That's part of this process. Is when you sell a technology or a business, you are giving up all that control. And so on the one hand, you have to let them develop their own vision and live with that. And you have to give them the information that they need in order to begin to develop that vision and recognize how they're going to use the technology and create value out of it. Maintaining momentum was critical. Even at times where things were going slowly, or that we were dealing with other problems, it was essential that we constantly move all of these diligence items forward. Some of them were incredibly tedious, documentation going back more than 6 years. And then at the same time, you have to continue to push normal activities because you have to constantly announce positive developments. You have to make sure that the acquirer knows that if, or at least believes that if they don't close the acquisition, you're going to move forward and be successful without them. Aligning everyone's interests is just can be incredibly difficult in these kinds of situations. So one of them is external, which is just making sure that your interests are aligned with the acquirer. That's often relatively simple because everybody's trying to the agreement's already been made, and now we just have to make sure that everyone's on board with all of the details. But internally, that can be an interesting challenge. Once there was a completed offer, or once there was a full offer on the table, shareholders were able to do calculations to see how much they were going to make off of their original investments. And because of the way that the company had been capitalized and the amount of time that it had taken to get to this acquisition, it was clear that some investors were going to do better than others. We talk about this idea of the knives coming out when an exit is close. And in this kind of situation, there were some difficult conversations to be had with some investors who were not going to make as much money as they had hoped and who weren't going to make as much money as some of the other investors who had come into the deal later. And so we had to regain people's trust, and we had to count votes and to make sure we had them as the deadline approached. And a certain amount of it was luck. I mean, bad luck from the lab flooding, good luck being able to get the technology to work the way we expected once we knew what was needed in the laboratory. These kinds of things really can play out. So what were the outcomes? Well, the business outcomes was a complete transaction, and the holdbacks were eventually paid out. So the company was a full cash acquisition of $20 million. Kinsey Nash hired everyone at the company except for the CEO. That had been part of the arrangement. There was simply no role for the CEO at Kinsey Nash. The Madison office was kept open for about 2.5 years, but it had been evident from the start that there wasn't going to be a real clear reason to keep that business open in Madison. It needed to be integrated with what Kinsey Nash was doing. The upshot was that just a couple of years later, Kinsey Nash was acquired by a much larger organization called DSM. And at that point, relocation packages were offered to nearly all the Noridi's employees, and a few of them took them, but many did not. The other aspect of this was that the technology development slowed considerably. It was now being managed from the top down rather than pushed or led, and quite frankly, executive level interest diminished. DSM maintained the program after they acquired it, but they wrote it down. That means that they decreased the amount of value they thought was associated with it, and in fact, as of the last data that I have was 2017, there had been no clinical trials using any of the original Noridi's technologies, which was really very disappointing for a lot of people involved. In the ecosystem, there were some more positive things. Of the 10 people who were employed at the time the company was bought, 2 remained at Kinsey Nash DSM for quite a while. 4 went on to other Madison startups. 3 went to larger medical device companies. 1 ended up in academia. Of the investors, many continued to invest regionally. They point to Noridi's as a rare successful exit. I do know for a fact that venture investors considers it to have been one of their successes because their time from investment to the exit was actually very quick. I believe it was only 2 or 3 years, and they made a good amount of money off of it. So broadly speaking, it was considered a success. I want to give you some last words from Jed White. Jed, someone you probably don't know, someone that I've known for many, many years. We did some work back in Milwaukee in a tech accelerator that led up to the initial conversations on Noridi's. Jed's continues to do investment work. He's now actually the manager of a venture fund based out of Task, which is a Madison-based company called Total Administrative Services Corporation. Their headquarters is out by the Madison airport. And at the time of all of this story was happening, Jed was the business development manager at Noridi's and was responsible for a significant amount of the acquisition work. And he was kind enough to put together a lot of this information and then share a couple of last words. His first comment was that startups are really hard, especially in the biotechnology space, and that luck often plays a bigger role than any one talented individual. And he talked about the fact that you had to wake up every morning with optimism and belief in what you're doing, and yet at the same time recognize that failure is more likely than success. The majority of biotech companies are simply not successful in the long run. And he suggested that you had to be honest with yourself about what you're willing to sacrifice. How important is this to you? How much is it going to mean to you both in the short term and the long term? When Jed came and spoke to my class on a number of occasions, he would often comment that, this was one of the most incredibly difficult experiences, so frustrating, so much work, so much effort, just absolutely exhausting, and that he wouldn't recommend it to anyone else, and yet at the same time he knew perfectly well that he was going to go back and do it again. And I thought that was a really fantastic observation about recognizing that this stuff is just incredibly hard and doesn't always work, and yet for many of us we end up coming back to it again and again and again. So I hope this gives you a useful insight, a little bit of a window into what really happens in an acquisition and an exit event. For me personally, being a co-founder of Noridi's was both a wonderful and frustrating experience. I was always very proud of the company and the underlying technology. I was obviously very happy to see a successful exit eventually, disappointed that so much of the technology has never seen any real use in the commercial world. But these are some of the realities of what being a tech entrepreneur is really like.